In the last two videos in this series, we're going to look at the Catholic Church's response to the Reformation, and also we're going to look at the legacy that the Reformation leaves behind. So in other words, what do we still have from it today? So the Catholic Church leadership is going to be torn on how to respond to the Reformation. Some are going to want to focus on making much needed changes in church practices and policies, while others are going to attack the Protestants. Ultimately, the church's response is going to involve both of these actions. This becomes known as the Catholic Reformation, and it's going to show that the church was willing to implement internal reforms regarding some practices. However, there would be no compromise on theological issues. So, with this so-called counter-reformation, the church is going to strike out against what it perceives to be its enemies. One early church response to the Reformation was to persecute those who had converted to Protestantism. However, the church also wanted to try to reconvert Protestants to Catholicism. The Inquisition provided a very tangible way to draw people back to Catholicism while also discouraging the spread of Protestant ideas. The practice of auto da fe, which is Portuguese for act of faith, the examination of those accused of heresy, and the punishment given to those found guilty begins to reappear. The punishments given are going to be varied, but could include things such as confession and penitential acts, and wearing an identifying badge, and forced assignment to a convent or a monastery. Those were the nuns or the monks would go. Those who do not recant or who were sentenced to death for their apostasy are going to be often subjected to torture and execution by various methods, including being burned at the stake. Pope Paul IV approved the harshness of these punishments and even said that if his own father were a heretic, he would gladly carry the wood to burn him at the stake. New Catholic orders are going to appear. The Capuchins, an order that was modeled after the Franciscans, the Ursulines, founded for the purpose of teaching young girls, and the Jesuits are going to be founded by Ignatius of Loyola. Others, like St. Teresa of Avila, called for the renewal of religious orders. St. Teresa focused on spiritual mysticism and called for a return to emotional devotion and piety. Earlier in his life, Ignatius had been a soldier and not especially devoted to religious life. While recuperating from a serious battle wound, he makes a pilgrimage to a monastery, and he vowed to help rekindle the Catholic faith. After he recovered from his injury, he also gave up the life of a soldier and began to pursue a life of good works, motivated by a renewed sense of religious piety. Ignatius began to attract followers and form the Society of Jesus, also known as the Jesuits, which the Pope recognized as a new religious order in 1540. The Jesuits took a special vow of obedience to the Pope and promising to make themselves available to perform any task asked of them. They were aggressive and militant defenders of the Catholic faith. Ignatius promoted the idea that a person should have an intense, emotional, religious conversion experience. And in his book, Spiritual Exercises, he described how to help people train spiritually. Jesuit teaching also drew in large part on a work by a medieval mystic, Thomas à Kempis, The Imitation of Christ, which provided directions for how a Christian should live and emphasized following the example set by the life of Christ. Jesuits came to play an important role in education. They established many schools that not only promoted theological education, but also taught non-religious subjects. Jesuits also become very active in missionary work, traveling not only to Europe, but also to India and China. And as a result, some of these Jesuit priests are also going to travel with the explorers as they head across the Atlantic Ocean. The Council of Trent. So in March of 1545, a council composed of Catholic dignitaries meets in the Alpine town of Trent, which lay on the border between Italy and Germany. And the Council of Trent had two main goals. Number one was to clarify and codify Catholic dogma and to reform problems and abuses within the Catholic Church. So as a result of Trent, the papacy became more centralized, organized, and aggressive. The ideas of the Reformation did not influence the Council of Trent to alter Catholic theology. Instead, the church officials on the council reaffirmed traditional doctrine orthodoxy and were determined to suppress what they see as heresy of these Protestant ideas. The council rejected point after point of theological change and reasserted the importance of the Pope, the seven sacraments, transubstantiation, and other beliefs. To the conclusions shown on this slide, the council also disavowed Greek, Hebrew, and vernacular translations of the Bible, declaring that the Latin Vulgate version was the only accepted translation of the Bible. Though it steadfastly held to traditional Catholic theology, the Council of Trent did decide to implement several practical changes to church practices and policies. An index of forbidden books was created that indicated what books Catholics should not read. Notables such as Luther, Erasmus, and Galileo were all listed in this index, of course. And the council encouraged monastic reforms and placed a renewed emphasis on priestly vows and obligations to their congregations. The council authorized the creation of new seminaries in order to increase the number of trained priests. And the church would continue to offer indulgences, but would freely give them to congregants rather than to sell them for profit. Let's look at some discussion questions from these slides. The first one, the Catholic Church responded to the Reformation in several ways. In general, what was its attitude regarding Protestant challenges to its religious doctrines and its rituals? Number two, a key issue throughout Reformation was the Catholic idea of a mystical presence of Christ in the Eucharist. Many Protestants rejected that Christ was actually present in the Eucharist, bread and wine. Why do you think Catholics viewed this idea as crucial to any defense of their faith? Number three, in what ways did the Church seek to reform itself so as to address some of the concerns that led many to reject it and to become Protestants? Okay, if you'll answer those questions, if you have any questions about that, email me, ask me in class, and I'll be glad to answer them.